Hello my friends, Stark here, and what if you have the misfortune to have to work upon a Kia Sephia? This is a 2001 model, last year of production, thankfully. I don't know whether these cars are reliable, I don't know whether they are comfortable, but I do know that they are horrible to work upon. Today we'll look at replacing the two serpentine belts on the right side of the engine. That'll be the front of the engine because it's a transverse block. I consider that Kia made two mistakes. First, they designed a twin belt system instead of a single belt. That means that in order to replace the inner belt here, the outer belt must be removed beforehand. Both belts, of course, are driven by the crankshaft. The inner belt runs the coolant pump and the alternator. The outer belt runs the power steering pump and the air conditioning compressor. The second mistake is not using tensioners. I guess with a twin belt system they didn't want to spend the money on two tensioners, and instead they've opted for an old school method of using components themselves to adjust the tension upon the belts. For the inner belt, tension is afforded by adjustment of the alternator, and for the outer belt, tension is afforded by adjustment of the power steering pump. This is really an old school method that we typically see upon older cars with V-belts, not too common with vehicles that have ribbed flat belts, serpentine style. So let's look at how to replace these belts. Which nuts and bolts do we need to adjust to get the alternator and the power steering pump moving? Power steering pump, 3 bolts to adjust. Our main adjuster is a 12mm bolt at the front, pointing toward the headlight assembly. On the side we have a 14mm bolt upon which the power steering pump hinges, and you can access that 14mm bolt through one of two apertures in the pulley. So just align the pulley so the aperture exposes the bolt head. Now we need to be underneath the vehicle to access a 14mm nut, so remove the plastic under tray. Now under the vehicle, slacken the 14mm nut, which is located immediately below the power steering pulley. Let's have some perspective. There's the AC compressor, which is positioned approximately below the power steering pump, and there are our crankshaft pulleys. Now to access that 14mm nut, I found it much easier to achieve with this air conditioning pipework tucked out of the way. Gently pull it down and across after removing the securing screw. Even with the power steering pump adjusted out, you'll likely find that there isn't a great deal of movement. That means that you may struggle to remove the old belt if you're keeping it, or to install the new belt. You'll likely have to gently pry the belt over one of the 3 pulleys on the system. Unlike the power steering pump, there's plenty of adjustment upon the alternator. Two 12mm bolts on the top side, main adjuster bolt, and another 12mm side bolt. Then underneath there's a 14mm anchor bolt upon which the alternator hinges. Now under the car again, and I'm struggling for a good view of the alternator anchor bolt. That's the big bolt at the bottom of the alternator, which permits the device to pivot. For belt removal, you'll want to loosen the anchor bolt first, and for belt installation, you'll want to tighten it last. We can see the far end of the anchor bolt poking through the ear of the alternator, but again struggling to show the head of the bolt. It's a 14mm. That bolt head is located about 2 inches above the right side drive shaft and just to the right of the engine oil filter. Well, the good news is that it's possible to access that bolt both from under the vehicle and topside through the engine bay. With the inner belt over the pulleys, you can apply tension to the alternator via the long adjustment bolt, and when you have good tension, we're not there yet, this is just for illustration, you can tighten the short locking bolt at the top, and finally the big anchor bolt underneath. I'd like to make a correction. I mentioned earlier that you may need to pry off and pry on the outer belt. I certainly needed to pry off this old worn out belt with a raggedy edge, and in fact it's missing an entire groove. But I did not need to pry on the new belt. It slipped over the pulleys just as it should do. So I think that time and heat had kind of sort of glued this old belt onto the pulley system, and hence I needed to pry on it to release it. I have measured it at 42.5 inches, and that's correct. So it's not the case that someone fitted an undersized belt to this car. For the outer belt, you'll want to tighten the bolts in the following order. Number 1, the adjuster bolt here at the front, that's the long bolt. That'll give you the tension that you need upon the belt. Number 2, the locking bolt underneath the power steering pump. And finally, number 3, the anchor bolt, which, as mentioned before, is accessed through an aperture in the pulley. Thank you so much for watching, my friends. Take care. See you next time.